16. There is a version of World War II that most people carry in their heads without questioning it. It has clear sides. It has obvious villains. It has a moral architecture that makes the whole thing, however terrible, feel comprehensible. The good nations fought the evil ones. The evil ones lost. Justice was served in a courthouse in Nuremberg, and the world moved forward having learned something fundamental about itself. That version is not a lie, exactly, but it is a selection. It is a careful arrangement of documented events that leaves other documented events quietly in the margins. Not because they are less real, but because they are less comfortable, because they complicate the architecture, because they suggest that the war was not primarily a confrontation between good and evil, but rather a confrontation between competing systems of organized violence, some of which were prosecuted after the fact, and some of which were absorbed into the infrastructure of the post-war world without comment. What follows is drawn from that margin. Not from conspiracy, not from revisionism with an ideological agenda, but from archives that were declassified decades after the war ended, from testimony that was suppressed during military tribunals, from operational records that governments held back not because they were fabricated, but because they were accurate. The uncomfortable truth about World War II is not that it was evil. It is that it was efficient. It is that the most catastrophic actions of that war were not carried out by madmen operating outside institutional structures, but by administrators, scientists, doctors, lawyers, logisticians, and officers who followed procedures, filed paperwork, met quotas, attended briefings, and went home at the end of the day. The war did not run on hatred alone. Hatred is too unstable, too variable, too dependent on individual psychology to sustain an industrial operation across 6 years and multiple continents. What sustained it was something far more durable. Routine, bureaucracy, the simple human capacity to subdivide a task until each individual component appears manageable, even neutral. A clerk who processes transfer orders does not think of himself as participating in mass murder. He processes transfer orders. A chemist who formulates a compound does not think of himself as a weapon. He formulates a compound. A pilot who releases ordnance over a city does not think of himself as a killer of children. He releases ordnance. This is not a psychological curiosity. It is the operating principle that made the war possible at the scale it occurred. The 24 subjects in this narration were not selected because they are the worst things that happened during World War II. They were selected because they were systematically obscured, administratively buried, legally protected, or simply never widely reported despite being documented in the historical record. They represent the portions of the war that the institutions which won that war preferred not to examine too closely once it was over. They are not footnotes. They are structural. The German civil service did not collapse when the Nazi Party came to power in 1933. It adapted. Career bureaucrats who had served the Weimar Republic continued filing documents, processing applications, administering regulations, and collecting salaries under the new government. The machinery of state did not require ideological conviction to function. It required competence and compliance. When the legal apparatus of persecution began to be constructed, starting with the professional civil service law of April 1933 and continuing through the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the implementation was not carried out by party radicals alone. It was carried out by the existing professional class, lawyers who drafted language, judges who applied it, administrators who enforced it. Many of these individuals had no particular animus toward the groups being targeted. They had professional obligations, they had career trajectories, they had mortgages and children in school and colleagues whose opinions of them they valued. The persecution of Jews, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and dozens of other defined categories did not require the entire German professional class to become true believers. It required them to do their jobs. This fact was inconvenient at Nuremberg. The prosecution at the International Military Tribunal was structured around the concept of individual criminal responsibility, which required demonstrating that specific individuals had specific criminal intent. The broader institutional participation, The thousands of lawyers and civil servants and business managers who had enabled the system without personally committing acts of violence was largely outside the scope of what the tribunal was designed to address. Some subsequent trials, the doctor's trial, the judge's trial, the ministry's trial, attempted to reach further into the institutional structure. Most resulted in sentences that were later reduced or commuted as the Cold War reorganized Western priorities. By the early 1950s, the process of institutional accountability had largely stopped. The German civil service continued to function, staffed in significant part by individuals who had served the same functions under the previous government. This was not a secret. It was a policy decision. The question of how the Holocaust was administered has a specific answer that most historical narratives obscure. It was administered through the normal channels of German bureaucratic life. Deportation orders moved through the railroad administration, through the Reich Main Security Office, through regional party authorities, through local police departments. The process involved requisition forms, scheduling conflicts, budget allocations, and interdepartmental memos about capacity and logistics. Heinrich Himmler's correspondence about the operations of the SS was organized, cross-referenced, and carefully archived. Adolf Eichmann, who coordinated the transportation logistics of the deportations, kept meticulous records. He was not, by the assessment of those who worked with him, a man consumed by hatred. He was a man consumed by administrative efficiency. His trial in Jerusalem in 1961 produced testimony that disturbed observers not because of its revelations of cruelty, but because of its revelations of ordinariness. He had done his job. He had done it well. He could not, even decades later, fully conceptualize why this was a problem. Hannah Arendt wrote about this and was widely criticized for it because the observation was genuinely uncomfortable. The discomfort was not with her analysis, which was careful and grounded in the trial record. The discomfort was with what the analysis implied about the relationship between institutional participation and moral culpability. If Eichmann was guilty, and he clearly was, then the thousands of German administrators who had performed analogous functions were also guilty. And if they were also guilty, then the post-war project of rebuilding German civil society with largely the same civil service was a project built on unacknowledged guilt. This was not a conclusion that the Western powers, who were simultaneously rebuilding Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, were prepared to reach. So the conclusion was not reached. The records were processed. The files were closed. The German military's relationship to the atrocities of the war was another area where the post-war record required careful management. The conventional narrative held that the Wehrmacht, the regular German military, had been a professional force that fought according to the laws of war, and that the crimes of the Nazi regime had been committed primarily by the SS and other party organizations. This narrative was convenient. It allowed the rapid rearmament and reintegration of German military officers into Western defense structures in the early Cold War period. It allowed former Wehrmacht officers to write memoirs that were received in the West as authoritative military history. Memoirs that consistently attributed any and all criminal activity to Hitler personally or to the SS, and consistently depicted the regular military as a professional organization that had simply been ordered to fight an unjust war. The documentary record does not support this narrative. Wehrmacht units participated directly in the mass shootings of Jewish civilians in the Soviet Union. Wehrmacht commanders issued explicit orders calling for the execution of commissars, the deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, and collective reprisals against civilian populations. The murder by starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, a figure estimated at between 2 and 3 million men, was a policy implemented by the Wehrmacht's own prisoner administration apparatus, not by the SS. The deliberate starvation of Leningrad, a city of several million civilians, was a Wehrmacht siege policy. The anti-partisan reprisals in Yugoslavia, Greece, France and the Soviet Union, in which villages were burned and civilian populations executed in ratios that sometimes reached 100 civilians killed for each German soldier lost, were Wehrmacht operational policies issued through official military channels. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht was not seriously challenged in the historical mainstream until the 1990s, when a traveling exhibition in Germany displayed documentary photographs of Wehrmacht atrocities. The exhibition provoked enormous controversy, including bomb threats. It ran from 1995 to 1999 and was seen by over 800,000 people. A second version, revised to address some methodological criticisms of specific photographs, ran from 2001 to 2004. The photographs had been in archives for 50 years. The operational decision-making of the Allied powers during the war contains its own archive of suppressed or inadequately examined material. The strategic bombing campaigns conducted by the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces against German cities constitute the most significant example. The official justification for area bombing was that it would undermine German industrial capacity and civilian morale. The actual effects are documented in detail. The bombing killed between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians, depending on methodology. It destroyed enormous quantities of housing, infrastructure, and cultural property. Its effects on German industrial production were, according to the post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, significantly less than anticipated. Its effect on civilian morale was, according to the same survey, approximately zero. The German civilian population did not revolt. It did not demand surrender. It continued to function under bombardment with an adaptability that the planners had not predicted and the post-war analysts found inconvenient to emphasize. The moral and legal status of the area bombing campaign was a question that the Allied powers were not prepared to examine at Nuremberg. The prosecution chose not to raise the bombing of civilian populations as a war crime, in part because the defense would have immediately pointed to Allied bombing as evidence that such attacks were not considered criminal by the nations prosecuting the tribunal. This legal strategy, known as tu quoque, was formally rejected by the tribunal. But the practical reality was that charging German defendants with bombing civilian cities while Allied bombers were simultaneously operating over Japanese cities was a prosecutorial position with obvious vulnerabilities. The subject was therefore not pursued. It has never been the subject of a formal legal accounting. Arthur Harris, the commander of RAF Bomber Command, who designed and implemented the area bombing strategy, and who understood clearly that he was targeting civilian populations rather than military objectives, was not tried. He was not formally reprimanded. He did not receive the peerage that most British commanders of equivalent rank received, an omission that reflected a quiet, official ambivalence about his legacy, but he was not held accountable in any formal sense. He wrote a memoir defending area bombing as a necessary and correct strategy. He lived until 1984. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 destroyed a city of significant cultural heritage, with a civilian population swelled by refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. Estimates of the death toll have varied widely and have been the subject of sustained historiographical controversy, in part because high estimates were adopted by Nazi propaganda and later by neo-Nazi groups seeking to equate Allied and German crimes. The most careful recent scholarship, including a commission established by the city of Dresden and published in 2010, estimates the death toll at approximately 22,000 to 25,000. This is a large number of civilians killed in a two-day bombing campaign of disputed military necessity at a moment when the war was clearly in its final weeks. The question of necessity was not examined at Nuremberg. It has not been examined by any subsequent legal body. The firebombing campaign against Japan, conducted by the United States Army Air Forces under Curtis LeMay, beginning in March 1945, was more destructive than the European bombing campaigns by any measure. The attack on Tokyo on the night of March 9 and 10, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. primarily through fire generated by incendiary bombs dropped across densely populated residential districts. The choice to use incendiary bombs against residential areas rather than high explosives against industrial targets was a deliberate policy shift implemented by LeMay, who understood that the wooden construction of Japanese urban residential areas made them exceptionally vulnerable to fire. The calculation was correct. The results were documented in operational reports that described the efficiency of the operation in terms of area burned and population density of the areas burned. This was before the atomic bombs. Between March and August 1945, American bombing campaigns burned and destroyed large portions of 67 Japanese cities, killing in total a number that conservative estimates place at 200,000. And others placed significantly higher. These attacks were not accompanied by warnings, not targeted at military facilities, and not subject to any meaningful legal review. LeMay, who understood the nature of what he was doing with characteristic bluntness, noted after the war that had the United States lost, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He understood the nature of what he was doing. He continued doing it. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, killed between 130,000 and 220,000 people, with deaths continuing to accumulate over subsequent months and years from radiation effects. The decision to use the bombs has been debated continuously since 1945 across a range of historical, ethical, and strategic dimensions. What is less commonly examined is the specific nature of the target selection process. Both cities were chosen in part because they had not been significantly damaged by conventional bombing, which meant they would provide a cleaner data set for assessing the weapon's effects. The scientists and military planners who selected the targets were not unaware that the primary purpose of the target selection criteria was to maximize the observable effects on a relatively undamaged urban environment. They selected targets accordingly. The civilians whose survival or death would provide the data were not a consideration separate from the data collection. They were the data. The medical experimentation conducted in Nazi concentration camps has been documented extensively and prosecuted at Nuremberg. The doctors' trial of 1946 and 1947 resulted in the conviction of 16 of 23 defendants and the execution of 7. The Nuremberg Code, establishing ethical standards for human experimentation, emerged from this trial. This portion of the historical record is relatively well known. What is less well known is what happened to the data generated by those experiments and what happened to the scientists who generated it. The human experimentation conducted in Japanese prisoner of war and civilian internment facilities by Unit 731 and related organizations was, in scope and systematic brutality, comparable to or exceeding the Nazi medical experiments. Unit 731, based in Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, conducted experiments on prisoners that included vivisection without anesthesia, deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax, exposure to extreme cold to study frostbite, pressure experiments, and biological weapons field tests conducted on live prisoners and civilian populations. The estimated number of people who died as a direct result of Unit 731's operations ranges from 3,000 to as many as 10,000. Biological weapons attacks on Chinese cities may have killed significantly more. The senior officers and scientists of Unit 731 were not prosecuted after the war. General Shiro Ishii, the unit's commanding officer and chief architect, reached an agreement with American occupation authorities. He and his colleagues provided the data from their experiments, data acquired through the torture and murder of prisoners, in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The MacArthur Occupation Authority in Japan classified the arrangement. The data was used by American biological weapons research programs. None of the senior Unit 731 personnel were tried. Ishii lived until 1959. The decision to grant immunity was made at the highest levels of the American Occupation Authority and was not disclosed to the other Allied powers who might have pressed for prosecution. The Soviet Union, which had its own interest in the biological weapons data, and which did prosecute some lower-level Unit 731 personnel at the Khabarovsk trials in 1949, was not informed. British and Australian authorities, who had their own nationals among the victims of Japanese prisoner-of-war atrocities, were not consulted. The arrangement remained classified for decades. When researchers began uncovering it in the 1980s through Freedom of Information Act requests and archival work in Japan, the response from American government officials was consistent with the response to most such discoveries. Confirmation that the documents existed, minimal elaboration, and no formal accountability. The treatment of prisoners of war under the German military administration in the Soviet Union constitutes one of the largest individual atrocities of the war and one of the least formally processed. The German military captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers between 1941 and 1945. Of these, approximately 3.3 million died in German captivity. The primary cause of death was deliberate starvation. Soviet prisoners were explicitly excluded from the provisions of the Geneva Convention by German policy on the grounds that the Soviet Union had not signed the convention, an interpretation of international law that conveniently reduced the administrative burden of maintaining prisoners under humane conditions. Soviet prisoners were placed in open enclosures, sometimes in winter conditions, without food, water, medical care, or shelter. They died in mass. German military records documented the process in logistical detail, including caloric allocations that were calculated to be below subsistence level. This was a policy decision, documented through the German military chain of command. It was not the result of supply shortages, though supply shortages existed. It was a deliberate choice to not supply sufficient food to sustain life. The economic planning behind Operation Barbarossa explicitly anticipated that Soviet resources would be diverted to German military use and that Soviet civilian and prisoner populations would face significant mortality as a result. The planning documents referred to this anticipated mortality in terms of population surplus and consumption reduction. The language was the language of resource management. The fate of Soviet prisoners of war was raised at Nuremberg, but was not the central focus of the prosecution. The 3.3 million dead received less attention in the post-war historical narrative than other atrocities of comparable or smaller scale, in part because the Soviet Union's own treatment of German prisoners was also a subject of significant documented abuse, with mortality rates among German prisoners held by the Soviets estimated at approximately 1 in 3. The post-war political configuration made a sustained institutional focus on Soviet prisoner mortality diplomatically complicated. The subject was not suppressed exactly, it was simply not elevated. The Action T4 program, through which the Nazi regime murdered approximately 200,000 to 300,000 people with physical and mental disabilities between 1939 and 1945, was a program that involved German physicians and medical administrators at every level. Patients in German psychiatric institutions, sanatoriums, and facilities for the disabled were assessed under a system that rated their capacity for economic productivity. Those rated as insufficiently productive were transferred to killing centers equipped with gas chambers and operated by medical personnel. The program was not publicly acknowledged by the Nazi regime. It was administered through a fictional organization, the Charitable Foundation for Cure and Institutional Care, whose name had been chosen specifically to obscure its function. The T4 program is significant in the history of the Holocaust, not only for its direct victims, but because it served as the operational training ground for the larger killing operations that followed. The personnel who designed and operated the gas chambers at Action T4 facilities were subsequently transferred to the Operation Reinhard death camps at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, bringing their technical expertise with them. The transition from killing the institutionalized disabled to killing Jewish deportees was an administrative reassignment. The methods were the same. The paperwork was updated. German physicians participated in T4 not under direct coercion, but through a combination of ideological alignment, professional incentive, and institutional normalization. The program required the active medical participation of doctors to review case files and sign death certifications. The certifications were fraudulent, listing causes of death that had nothing to do with the actual method of killing, but they were signed by licensed medical professionals who understood what they were signing. After the war, a significant number of T4 physicians returned to medical practice in West Germany. Some held prominent institutional positions. The medical licenses of T4 physicians were not systematically revoked. The professional organizations responsible for licensing did not systematically conduct reviews. The use of concentration camp labor by German industrial corporations was another area where post-war accountability was incomplete. Companies including Volkswagen, BMW, Bayer, BASF, Siemens, Krupp, and dozens of others used concentration camp prisoners as forced labor during the war. The prisoners worked under conditions that caused significant mortality. They were supplied by the SS on a contractual basis, with the corporations paying the SS a daily rate per prisoner, and the SS providing guards and maintaining the physical custody of the workers. The workers themselves received no compensation. The corporations maintained production records that documented the use of this labor in detail. At Nuremberg, executives from several companies, including Krupp, were tried and convicted for the use of slave labor. The sentences imposed were substantial. By 1950, most had been released under amnesty programs conducted by the American Occupation Authority, under pressure from American business interests and Cold War strategic considerations. The companies themselves were not dissolved or subjected to sustained asset forfeiture. They were restructured. They returned to operation in the post-war German economy and became foundational elements of the West German economic recovery. The heirs and successors of these companies became major participants in the global economy. Compensation programs for forced laborers were established in Germany beginning in the 1950s, but were limited in scope and difficult to access. A larger compensation fund was established in 2000 following litigation and advocacy from survivors and their descendants, and provided payments from both the German government and participating companies. By 2000, a significant number of the direct victims of forced labor were deceased. The fund distributed approximately 4.4 billion euros to approximately 1.6 million claimants, many of whom were elderly, and many of whom had been waiting for compensation for more than 50 years. The role of the Swiss financial system in the German war economy was a subject that received serious historical investigation only in the 1990s. Switzerland maintained its neutrality throughout the war and continued to operate as a functioning international financial center throughout the conflict. Swiss banks accepted gold deposits from Germany, gold that included looted reserves from occupied countries and gold taken from Jewish victims of the Holocaust, including dental gold removed from murder victims at concentration camps. Swiss banks also held assets deposited by Jewish refugees who subsequently died in the Holocaust, and in the post-war period resisted the claims of survivors and heirs by requiring documentation that the victims could not produce because their documents had been destroyed along with the victims. A commission headed by Paul Volcker, the former Federal Reserve Chairman, investigated dormant accounts in Swiss banks in the late 1990s and identified accounts belonging to Holocaust victims totaling $1.25 billion. Swiss banks reached a settlement in 1998 for $1.25 billion. Swiss National Bank records subsequently examined by the Bergier Commission, which was established by the Swiss government, documented in detail the acquisition and processing of looted gold throughout the war. The documentation was in the archives throughout the post-war period. The investigation was not conducted until public pressure, primarily from American Jewish organizations and the United States government, made continued avoidance politically untenable. The post-war fate of Nazi scientists and technical specialists under Operation Paperclip is a subject that has been documented in increasing detail over the past 3 decades, but remains incompletely processed in public understanding. The United States military and intelligence services recruited approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists between 1945 and the late 1950s. The recruitment was conducted under a program that was initially classified and that involved, in numerous individual cases, the active falsification of the recruits' records to remove or minimize evidence of their involvement in war crimes, SS membership, or participation in programs that used slave labor or conducted human experimentation. Werner von Braun, who led the development of the V-2 ballistic missile at Peenemünde and subsequently the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon, was an SS officer who had personally supervised the use of concentration camp labor at the Mittelwerk underground factory where V-2 missiles were produced. The labor conditions at Mittelwerk were documented as extraordinarily brutal. The mortality rate among the workers was high. Von Braun was aware of conditions at the facility. He was recruited under paperclip, his SS record was handled appropriately by the program administrators, and he became the most prominent figure in the American space program. He received the National Medal of Science in 1975. Walter Schreiber, a senior German military physician who had been involved in human experimentation on concentration camp prisoners, was brought to the United States under paperclip. When his background became known through reporting in 1952, he was quietly transferred to a position in Argentina rather than prosecuted or returned to Germany. Kurt Blome, who had directed Nazi Germany's biological weapons research program and had conducted human experiments on concentration camp prisoners, was acquitted at the doctor's trial at Nuremberg after American military intelligence intervened to suppress potentially incriminating evidence because they wanted access to his research. He was subsequently recruited under paperclip and worked with American biological warfare researchers. The Soviet Union conducted a parallel recruitment program, generally referred to as Operation Osoaviakim, in which Soviet military and intelligence agencies recruited German scientists and engineers, in many cases involuntarily, transporting them and their families to the Soviet Union to work on weapons development programs. The Soviet rocket and missile program drew substantially on German expertise, including personnel from the same Peenemünde program that supplied the American space effort. Both superpowers entered the Cold War with significant German technical infrastructure incorporated into their weapons development operations. Neither power conducted a comprehensive legal accounting of the records of the individuals they recruited. The Nuremberg trials themselves, which have occupied a foundational position in the development of international criminal law, operated under constraints and exclusions that were the product of the political circumstances of their creation rather than purely legal logic. The trials were organized and conducted by the victorious powers. This arrangement created structural limitations that the prosecution acknowledged and attempted to manage. The tout quoque defense, in which defendants argued that the acts charged against them were also committed by the prosecuting powers, was formally excluded from consideration by the tribunal, which ruled that criminal acts by one party did not justify or excuse criminal acts by another. This was a legally coherent position. It was also a position that allowed the tribunal to avoid examining substantial evidence of acts by Allied powers that, under the same legal standards being applied to the defendants, might reasonably have been charged as criminal. The Katyn massacre, in which Soviet NKVD forces murdered approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police officers, and intellectuals in 1940, was included in the Nuremberg indictment as a German war crime. The Soviet prosecution presented evidence in support of this charge. The evidence was not credible. The German defendants produced evidence, including testimony, that established Soviet responsibility. The tribunal declined to include the Katyn massacre in its final judgment, effectively dropping the charge without formal resolution. The Soviet Union maintained its false account of Katyn responsibility until 1990, when Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged Soviet responsibility and released relevant documents. The documents were there throughout the post-war period. The post-war treatment of collaborators in occupied countries was inconsistent and frequently incomplete. In France, the post-war purge of collaborators, known as the épuration, resulted in the official execution of approximately 9,000 individuals and the extrajudicial killing of several thousand more. Many collaborators, particularly those with significant social or professional standing, received lighter treatment through a combination of legal maneuver, social connection, and the accelerating political pressure to restore French national unity. The Vichy regime's role in the deportation of Jewish residents of France, including in the notorious WWII roundup of July 1942, in which French police under French civilian command organized the arrest of 13,000 Jews who were subsequently deported to Auschwitz, was not fully officially acknowledged by the French government until 1995, when President Jacques Chirac offered a formal apology. The roundup had occurred 53 years earlier. The French participants in that operation who had survived to 1995 were very old. In the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and across occupied Europe, the post-war accounting with collaboration was similarly incomplete. Former collaborators who did not face prosecution frequently returned to professional and civic life. The documentation of their wartime activities remained in archives that were not consistently opened or systematically examined. Local police forces that had participated in the enforcement of occupation policies continued to function after liberation without systematic personnel review. The economic dimension of the Holocaust, specifically the process by which the assets of Jewish victims were confiscated, transferred, and ultimately absorbed into the financial systems of Germany and occupied Europe, was the subject of sustained scholarly investigation beginning in the 1990s. The process of confiscation was thorough, documented, and operated through normal financial and legal channels. Bank accounts were frozen and then liquidated. Real property was valued by registered appraisers and transferred at prices that reflected the coercive circumstances of the transaction. Businesses were transferred to non-Jewish ownership in a process known as Aryanization, which involved lawyers, accountants, notaries, and banking institutions performing standard professional functions in service of a legally mandated property transfer system. The assets moved through the German financial system and were in many cases invested in the war economy. After the war, the restoration of confiscated property was incomplete. Heirless property, assets whose owners had been killed with no surviving heirs, remained in the possession of governments, insurance companies, and private owners. German insurance companies held insurance policies issued to Jewish policyholders who had been murdered, and after the war resisted paying claims on the grounds that the policyholder could not present the policy or that the policy had lapsed. An International Commission on Holocaust-era Insurance Claims, established in 1998 under the chairmanship of former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, negotiated the payment of approximately $307 million in claims, a fraction of the actual value involved. Real property was the subject of extensive litigation and administrative proceedings in Germany and throughout Eastern Europe, complicated by subsequent nationalizations under communist governments that had their own reasons to resist property restitution. The legal proceedings continued to the present day. The post-war occupation of Japan proceeded under conditions that shaped the historical record in ways that are still not fully processed. The American Occupation Authority under General Douglas MacArthur made a series of decisions in the first weeks and months of occupation that determined what portions of Japan's wartime history would be prosecuted, what would be protected, and what would be obscured. The decision to preserve the institution of the emperor and to immunize Emperor Hirohito from prosecution was made for reasons of occupation stability and was understood at the time to require the systematic limitation of testimony that might implicate the emperor in specific wartime decisions. Witnesses before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East were coached by American occupation officials regarding the scope of testimony that was appropriate to provide. The Tokyo Tribunal, which ran from 1946 to 1948, convicted 25 defendants, 7 of whom were executed. The tribunal did not charge anyone for the Nanjing massacre of 1937 and 1938, in which Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers were killed in numbers estimated at 100,000 to 300,000 by conservative modern scholarship. General Iwane Matsui, who commanded Japanese forces during the massacre, was convicted for his failure to control his troops, but the charge was framed in terms of command responsibility rather than as a direct accounting for the events. Emperor Hirohito, who had been briefed on the situation in Nanjing during its occurrence, was not charged or questioned. The Nanjing massacre remains a subject of active historical contestation in China-Japan relations, with the Japanese government's position on the scale and nature of events having varied across different administrations. Documentary evidence in Japanese military archives, portions of which remained restricted for decades after the war, continues to inform historical understanding of events that have significant ongoing diplomatic implications. The British conduct of the war in its colonial territories is another area where the historical record contains material that the post-war British historical narrative did not prominently feature. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which an estimated 2 to 3 million people in British India died of starvation, occurred during a period of active British administrative decision-making about food distribution, export policy, and resource allocation in Bengal. The wartime colonial administration prioritized military supply needs and maintained food exports from Bengal despite documented shortage conditions. Winston Churchill's government was repeatedly briefed on the mortality in Bengal and maintained existing policies. Churchill's personal communications regarding the Bengal famine include statements that historians have characterized as reflecting indifference to Indian civilian mortality. The Bengal famine was not the subject of prosecution after the war. It was classified as a wartime supply problem and a consequence of war conditions rather than as a policy outcome. A formal Indian government inquiry commission reported in 1945 that the famine was man-made and preventable. The report's findings were not widely discussed in British public discourse. The famine's scale and the administrative decisions that contributed to it have been the subject of renewed scholarly attention in recent decades, but formal institutional acknowledgement from the British government has remained limited. The use of chemical weapons in the Second World War presents a situation where the documented historical record contains both acknowledged and inadequately acknowledged elements. Nazi Germany's possession and production of chemical weapons, including the nerve agents tabun and sarin, discovered by German chemists in the late 1930s and early 1940s, is documented. Germany did not use these agents on the battlefield, a decision that has been the subject of historical debate regarding whether it reflected strategic calculation, fear of retaliation, or Hitler's personal experience of being gassed in World War I. British plans for chemical weapons use, however, are documented in cabinet records that were released decades after the war. Churchill directed the military to prepare plans for large-scale mustard gas attacks on German civilian populations in 1944, in response to the V-1 flying bomb attacks on Britain. The plans were prepared. They were not implemented, in part because of objections from military advisors regarding the likelihood of retaliation. Churchill's directive was unambiguous in intent. It asked for an analysis of whether the advantage to Britain would be worth the cost of breaking the taboo on chemical warfare in a war where both sides possessed chemical weapons. American military planning for the invasion of Japan, which was superseded by the atomic bomb decision, included provision for chemical weapons use against Japanese military and civilian targets. The Pacific Theater saw the use of incendiary weapons that, while not classified as chemical under existing conventions, produced effects on civilian populations that were functionally comparable. The boundary between incendiary and chemical in operational targeting planning was a legal distinction with limited operational significance. The specific conditions in which Allied prisoners of war were held by Japan is a documented area that generates ongoing diplomatic friction between Japan and former Allied prisoner nations, particularly Australia, Britain, and the United States. Japanese military doctrine held that surrender was dishonorable and that soldiers who surrendered had forfeited their claim to respectful treatment. This doctrine was applied through the administration of prisoner-of-war camps, in which mortality rates among Allied prisoners reached levels that, under any standard comparable to those applied at Nuremberg, constituted criminal mistreatment. The death rate among British and American prisoners held by Japan was approximately 27%. The death rate among Allied prisoners held by Germany was approximately 4%. The construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, known to Allied prisoners who worked on it as the Death Railway, required the forced labor of approximately 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and between 180,000 and 250,000 Asian laborers. The conditions of construction, including inadequate food, water and medical care, disease, and physical abuse, resulted in approximately 12,000 Allied prisoner deaths and an estimated 90,000 Asian laborer deaths. The railway was completed ahead of schedule. Senior Japanese officers responsible for the administration of the construction were tried at war crimes tribunals. The most severe sentences were for individual acts of brutality rather than for the systemic conditions of labor that produced the majority of deaths. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany revealed in its operational documentation a sustained and deliberate program of selecting targets for their civilian rather than military significance. The RAF's Area Bombing Directive of February 1942 explicitly identified the morale of the civilian population as a primary target and specified that attacks should focus on the residential areas of industrial cities. The directive was drafted by the Air Ministry and implemented by Bomber Command. Subsequent American bombing policy, while maintaining a formal distinction between precision and area bombing that the actual capabilities of night bombing, made largely theoretical, produced comparable effects on civilian populations. The operational records of Bomber Command's night campaign document, in precise terms, the tons of bombs dropped, the areas of cities destroyed, and the proportions of working-class residential housing versus industrial facilities affected. The targeting analysis was detailed and sophisticated. The analysts understood what they were hitting. The damage assessment teams understood what they were assessing. The institutional knowledge of what was being done was clear and documented. The institutional willingness to subsequently frame this documentation in terms of its strategic necessity rather than its moral content was equally clear. The post-war documentation of German rocket weapon development, specifically the V2 program, reveals the full institutional structure of a weapons development program that combined cutting-edge engineering with systematized murder. The Mittelwerk underground factory in the Harz Mountains, where V2 missiles were assembled beginning in late 1943, was supplied with labor from the Dora concentration camp, which was established specifically to provide workers for the factory. Prisoners worked in underground tunnels in conditions of extreme cold, inadequate food and water, and systematic physical brutality. They slept in the tunnels in the early months of the operation. The mortality rate was high enough that the camp maintained its own small gas chamber and crematorium. The rockets assembled under these conditions were used to attack London and Antwerp, killing approximately 9,000 civilians and military personnel across the course of the campaign. The engineering achievement was real and significant. The program's technical director, von Braun, continued to develop rockets in American service. The camp commander, Hans Kammler, disappeared at the end of the war under circumstances that remain disputed by historians. Kammler had overseen the construction and administration of Auschwitz-Birkenau as an SS construction officer before moving to the rocket program. His post-war fate, whether he was captured, killed, or recruited, is not definitively established in the documentary record. The role of medicine in the Nazi state extended beyond the concentration camp experiments into the broader transformation of the German medical profession. German physicians were, by the end of the 1930s, members of the Nazi Party at higher rates than any other professional group. Medical organizations had been among the first professional bodies to purge Jewish members, and the medical profession had provided significant intellectual support for the racial hygiene programs that preceded and then ran parallel to the extermination policies. The sterilization program established by the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring of 1933 sterilized approximately 375,000 people between 1933 and 1945. The law was administered by hereditary health courts that included medical members, and the decisions of those courts were implemented by physicians performing involuntary surgical procedures. German medical education during this period was restructured around racial science. Medical students were taught population genetics as applied to racial categories. The textbooks were written by credentialed professors at accredited universities. The professional societies endorsed the curriculum. The students who graduated from these programs went on to practice medicine, serve in the military, administer institutions, and in some cases, conduct the experiments that became the subject of the doctor's trial. After the war, German medical education was restructured again. The restructuring did not require, in most cases, accounting from the professors who had taught the previous curriculum. The systematic looting of art and cultural property by German military and SS units from occupied territories is a process that has been documented in extraordinary detail, in part because the Germans were meticulous record keepers, and in part because art recovery has attracted sustained institutional and media attention that other forms of wartime looting have not. The Einsatzstab, Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the special task force responsible for the systematic looting of Jewish and state cultural property, maintained detailed inventories of what it had taken, from where, and where it had been sent. These inventories survived the war in sufficient quantity to allow post-war restitution efforts, though complete restitution remains incomplete 7 decades after the war's end. The looting was not limited to Germany. Soviet military units, operating under specific orders, removed enormous quantities of art and cultural property from Germany and German-occupied territories at the end of the war. The Soviet program, characterized by Soviet authorities as compensation for German destruction of Soviet cultural heritage, resulted in the transfer to the Soviet Union of hundreds of thousands of objects. Many remain in Soviet and subsequently Russian collections, nominally held as war trophies. The Russian government has not returned the majority of these items, and Russian law since 1998 has formally classified them as the property of the Russian Federation. The legal and diplomatic status of these objects continues to generate controversy between Russia, Germany, and other affected nations. The post-war operation of former Nazi concentration camp sites in Eastern Europe under Soviet administration has been inadequately documented in Western historical understanding. Several concentration camp sites, including Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, were repurposed by Soviet occupation authorities as internment camps for German prisoners, former Nazis, and political opponents of the Soviet occupation. These Soviet special camps operated until 1950. The estimated total mortality in the Soviet special camps in the former German territories was approximately 40,000 people, of whom many died of disease and starvation. The camps operated under Soviet administrative authority and without meaningful external oversight. The documentation of their existence and operation was suppressed under East German communist governance and became part of the West German and subsequently unified German historical discourse only after reunification. The evacuation of concentration camp prisoners ahead of Allied military advances in the final months of the war produced what historians have called the death marches, in which prisoners who had survived years of camp conditions were forced to march in winter with inadequate clothing, food or shelter to other camp locations or simply away from the advancing Allied front lines. The death toll on these marches was significant. Prisoners who could not walk were shot. Prisoners who fell behind were shot. The march routes passed through German civilian territory. German civilians observed the marches. The condition of the prisoners was visible. The question of German civilian awareness of the Holocaust and of concentration camp conditions generally is a historical subject that has generated sustained debate. The evidence suggests that significant information was available in German public life about the nature of what was happening to Jewish and other persecuted populations. but that the institutional structures of the Third Reich created both information control mechanisms that limited the circulation of specific operational details and social pressure mechanisms that discouraged inquiry. Aerial photographs taken by Allied reconnaissance aircraft documented concentration camp facilities with sufficient clarity that analysts could identify barrack structures, prisoner populations, and, in some camps, gas chamber and crematorium complexes. These photographs were available during the war. The decision not to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz and not to bomb the camp facilities themselves was made at senior levels of the Allied military command. The arguments about why Auschwitz was not bombed have been made and contested by historians for decades. The arguments about military feasibility, about the precedence of other military priorities, about whether bombing would have been effective, are documented in the planning records. What is also documented is that the information was available, that the requests were made by Jewish organizations and by the Polish government in exile, and by individuals within the Allied governments who understood what was happening, and that the decision not to act was made. The decision not to bomb is documented, the reasoning is documented, the records were there. The post-war establishment of the State of Israel, the displacement of Palestinian Arab populations that accompanied it, and the relationship between these events and the Holocaust is a subject that requires more space and more careful treatment than this narration can provide. But its inclusion as a consequence of the war that the post-war institutional order chose to manage in specific ways rather than others is relevant to any accounting of how the war ended and what it produced. The war produced geopolitical consequences that restructured the political map of multiple regions, consequences that were managed through institutional decisions that privileged some claims over others and that continue to generate violence and displacement in the present. The French use of captured German military personnel as de facto slave labor in the immediate post-war period is a documented practice that received minimal official attention. An estimated 600,000 German prisoners of war were held by France after the war's end, in conditions that violated the Geneva Convention's provisions for prisoner treatment and repatriation. These prisoners were used for labor in French reconstruction, in agriculture, and in mine clearance operations. Death rates among German prisoners held by France in the immediate post-war period were higher than German death rates in American captivity. The International Committee of the Red Cross documented conditions in French prisoner camps and registered formal complaints. French authorities resisted Red Cross inspection for a period. The prisoners began to be repatriated in the late 1940s. The documentation of their treatment generated limited formal accountability. American military and intelligence services' post-war relationship with former Nazi collaborators in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, conducted through what has been characterized as the Rat Line network and through subsequent Cold War intelligence operations, represents another area of the post-war record that required several decades to partially surface. American intelligence agencies recruited former collaborators with specific skill sets, including language capability, regional knowledge, established networks, and anti-Soviet orientation, and incorporated them into intelligence operations against the Soviet bloc. The individuals recruited through these programs ranged from political figures with documented collaboration records to individuals with documented involvement in atrocities. The records relating to these programs were classified at the highest levels. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 required American intelligence agencies to declassify records relating to Nazi war criminals and their post-war activities. The subsequent declassification process, which extended over several years, produced documentation of intelligence relationships with individuals whose wartime records had been known to the recruiting agencies and had been treated as an acceptable trade-off given their Cold War utility. The documents confirmed relationships with individuals who had been involved in deportations, killings, and collaboration across multiple occupied countries. The individuals in question were, in most cases, deceased by the time the documents became public. The development of nerve agents and their incorporation into American and Soviet military stockpiles in the post-war period represents a direct continuation of German chemical weapons research. American researchers had access to German chemical weapons data through captured documents, through the recruitment of German scientists, and through the analysis of German chemical weapons stockpiles captured at the end of the war. The post-war chemical weapons programs of both superpowers drew on this research. The German nerve agent stockpiles were themselves a subject of post-war administrative management, with substantial quantities disposed of in the Baltic and North Seas through ocean dumping. Hundreds of thousands of tons of chemical weapons ammunition were dropped into these waters. The munitions remain on the seafloor and continue to be a documented environmental and safety issue for fishing and maritime operations in the affected areas. The German military's administration of occupied Soviet territory under the guidelines of the Commissar Order and the starvation policy created conditions of civilian mortality that were, in aggregate numbers, comparable to or exceeding the Holocaust in their scale. Historian Timothy Snyder's work on what he called the Bloodlands, the territories of Eastern Europe, where German and Soviet policies intersected, documents the multiple overlapping policies of mass killing that occurred in these territories between 1933 and 1945. The total mortality from German policy in the Soviet Union, including prisoner deaths, civilian killings, starvation, and the Holocaust in the occupied Soviet territories, has been estimated at between 15 and 20 million. The scale of this mortality is documented. Its integration into historical understanding in the West was complicated throughout the Cold War by the political inconvenience of extensively examining Soviet suffering, which generated sympathy for the Soviet state, and by the narrative dominance of the Western Front experience, which was more accessible and less complicated by post-war geopolitics. The post-war German government's management of its own historical record involved decisions about what to archive, what to release, and what to process through official memorial and educational programs that shaped public understanding for decades. The establishment of the Federal Archives and subsequent archival opening processes provided important primary source access that supported historical scholarship. German memorial sites and educational programs became, over time, among the most extensive and well-funded in the world. This institutional processing of the past was genuine and significant. It was also selective. The full extent of Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities was not part of official German historical education until the debate generated by the Wehrmacht exhibition in the 1990s forced a public reckoning that German cultural institutions were initially resistant to. The language used in German administrative documents about the killing operations is a subject that reveals the deliberate construction of euphemism as an institutional tool. The final solution, the special treatment, the resettlement in the East, the evacuation, the security measures. These were terms used in official documents to describe killing operations. The language was not accidental. It was chosen and maintained as a matter of institutional policy. The use of coded language served both to conceal the operations from external observation and to provide those implementing the operations with terminology that maintained professional distance from the nature of what they were doing. Bureaucrats who received orders expressed in this language could implement them while maintaining a verbal and cognitive space between their professional function and its outcome. The post-war legal concept of crimes against humanity, which emerged from the Nuremberg Tribunal's framework, has been the most significant international legal inheritance of the tribunal's work. Its application in subsequent international criminal law, in the statutes of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the International Criminal Court, reflects the attempt to institutionalize the principle that certain acts are criminal, regardless of their authorization by state authority. The application of this principle has been inconsistent. The countries with the greatest capacity to avoid accountability for actions that might be characterized under this principle have largely done so. The Soviet NKVD's mass operations during the period of the Nazi-Soviet Pact from 1939 to 1941 which included the Katyn massacre and the mass deportations of Polish, Baltic, and other populations from territories occupied under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocols, were operations carried out by a state that became an allied power and subsequently a founding member of the United Nations and a permanent member of the Security Council with veto authority. The victims of these operations were, in the geopolitical organization of the post-war world, not in a position to secure international accountability mechanisms against the power responsible. The Katyn massacre's inclusion in the Nuremberg indictment as a German crime, the tribunal's handling of the evidence, and the subsequent 50-year Soviet maintenance of a false account represent a case study in how international legal institutions interact with political power. The full accounting of what was known, by whom, and when, regarding the Holocaust, is a subject of ongoing historical inquiry that continues to produce documentation about the information flows that existed during the war. Allied governments received reports from multiple sources, including Jewish organizations, resistance networks, diplomatic dispatches, and intercepted German communications. The British code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park decrypted German police communications that included statistical reports on mass shootings in the Soviet Union as early as 1941. These reports were seen at senior levels of the British government. The decision about what to do with this information, how to publicize it, how to respond to it, how to weigh it against other strategic considerations, was made by real people in specific institutional contexts. The war ended in May 1945 in Europe and September 1945 in Asia. The institutional structures that had enabled it, the nation-state system, the professional military establishments, the industrial complexes that had produced weapons and processed resources, the bureaucratic apparatuses that had administered populations, did not end with the armistice documents. They were restructured, realigned, and in many cases continued to function with considerable continuity of personnel. The legal frameworks established at Nuremberg introduced new principles into international law. Their application depended, as all legal frameworks depend, on the political will of the states capable of enforcing them. The states capable of enforcing them were the states whose own conduct during the war had generated questions that the new legal framework, if applied consistently, would have required them to answer. The post-war world was built by the same institutional capacities that had built the war. The efficiency that had organized mass death was redirected. The administrative capabilities that had processed populations were turned to reconstruction. The scientists who had worked on weapons continued their research under new institutional arrangements and with new funding sources and toward new strategic objectives. The lawyers who had argued for and against the application of new international legal norms returned to practice in systems that had existed before the war and continued after it. The war had been an event of extraordinary scale and destruction. It had not been a rupture in the fundamental character of the institutions that had produced it. The trials ended. The sentences were served, reduced, or set aside. The documents went into archives. The survivors aged. The perpetrators aged. The governments issued commemorations on significant anniversaries. The files accumulated in basements and vaults in Berlin and Washington and London and Moscow and Tokyo, organized, cross-referenced, and waiting for researchers with clearances and time and sufficient interest in what had actually happened rather than what had been said to have happened, and new files continued to be classified at the same rate that old files were opened, and the machinery continued to process whatever it was given to process, as it always had.